Welcome to SCS Smart Scores webinar series.
Well, good morning, everybody, or afternoon, depending where you live in the country. Welcome to our webinar this morning on high impact rubrics. This will be a short webinar today. We're going to try and keep it down to about 30 minutes or so, but I'm excited to welcome two principals who are practitioners and have been presenting to districts and schools across the country on how to create high impact, high performance rubrics. We've all seen really bad rubrics, so it's time to learn how to make really good rubrics. First, we have Steve Retzlaff. He is the principal at Ashland Middle School in Ashland, Oregon. He has been principal there for, I think, we're going on what, 17 years, maybe, something like that. Yep. He is also a co-founder of Smart Ed Systems and will be presenting today with Catherine Holden. Catherine is the principal at Talent Middle School in Talent, Oregon. Catherine's also a co-founder of Smart Ed Systems and has joined Steve and work together to present on rubrics everywhere that you've heard about. In addition, Catherine is just finishing up. I would be remiss if I didn't say Catherine is the 2022 National Assistant Principal of the Year for her work as assistant principal in previous years. So we're very excited about that. I think she's going to pass the baton to the next Assistant Principal of the Year in Washington, D.C. coming up soon. But without further delay, let me turn it over to Steve and Catherine to talk about how to create some good rubrics, some high impact, high quality rubrics. Steve, Catherine?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Thanks for the introduction. And thank you to those of you who are joining us today. We're excited to share a little bit about what we've learned in making high impact rubrics, as Jim likes to say. Catherine and I have spent a lot of time working on building rubrics in all content areas with a number of different staff here and others around the country. And we love this work. And so we're just excited to share today a little bit about it. Jim, if you want to go to the next slide. And so just to give you a little bit of quick background on our journey, I think it was maybe 10 years ago, Catherine and I were working here at Ashland Middle School, and our staff started transitioning to proficiency or standards-based or mastery-based learning. And one of the tools that we wanted to put in place to help our staff with this transition and help our students was to start building rubrics that got at and defined what it was our teachers were looking for from their students. So, the reason why we all use rubrics, so nothing new there. But what we found, and Jim, if you want to go to the next slide, when we had our teachers start to draft their rubrics, we saw that they were falling into some of the pitfalls that I think come with traditional rubrics. Rubrics, again, they're not new, nothing new about rubrics. We've all seen rubrics. I get, assessed as an administrator on a rubric. Teachers, we have a rubric that evaluates and assesses our teachers' effectiveness, and rubrics have been around in classrooms for a long, long time. But what we found was that our teachers were used to the rubrics they had seen or maybe used themselves as students or were using in teaching to be evaluated on. And those rubrics were often very vague, general, and subjective. And sure enough, as our teachers started drafting their initial rubrics for their power standards, they were finding that we were finding that their rubrics were falling into these pitfalls as well. And I'm going to show you, Jim, if you can go to the next slide, a little bit about, this is an example of what we saw in some of those initial drafts from our teachers. There were, we have 3 levels, but oftentimes there's 4. There's sort of the proficient level, the level that everybody's hoping to achieve, and then maybe a level above that. And then oftentimes teachers were kind of hoping to have a level that said you're almost there, that approaching proficient level, and then the not proficient, you're not there, you can't yet do it. And we saw this kind of language that, the proficient was the content is somewhat accurate and fairly clear. And then the distinguishing qualifier for being better than proficient, mastery or exceeds or whatever label, folks use for that higher level on the rubric was something like content is mostly accurate and consistently clear. And you can see there's not a lot of difference in that bold language as you read across the rubric from left to right. The approaching proficient, the content is somewhat vague and only partially clear, or proficient, the writer exhibits some control in the development of the ideas versus the writer exhibits control in the development of the ideas. So what's the difference between some control and having control, or inconsistent control, or being somewhat accurate and fairly clear, or somewhat vague or partially clear? A lot of that is open to interpretation and doesn't really help the student know what it is the teacher's looking for, or what it looks like when the student is demonstrating that level of proficiency or reaching the level that the teacher's looking for in the work. And if you go to the next slide.
I want to point out just
go ahead,
before we go to the next slide. Sorry, can you go back one, Jim? I got to figure out how to interrupt Steve before he says go to the next slide. So two things I want to point out here, because I think it'll help as we move into the style of rubric that we've started writing. One is that noticing, when we have 4, or sometimes people want 5 levels of criteria, I think sometimes that's when we back ourselves into a corner where we're starting to almost have to add some of these subjective words because we don't know how to distinguish the levels otherwise. So in this first case, when we're talking about content, when we start to stretch it into 4 or even 5 levels, we're almost inherently starting to say, like, well, we just need the content to be a little more clear, somewhat clear, now mostly clear, because we don't have other things that we can start to say, well, the content needs to include these things specifically. So we'll get into that when we start to show you how we've distinguished levels in our mastery column in our rubric 2.0s. I think the other thing, though, that I want to point out, sorry, Jim, can you go back just one more time, is that this language comes from similar to our state writing rubrics. Sometimes these words, somewhat accurate or fairly clear, are on those rubrics, but those are rubrics that teachers then, or scoring, people who are going to be scoring essays, for example, go to sometimes 3 and 4 day trainings to learn what does somewhat vague or somewhat accurate look like, sound like. They go through, calibration activities. They look at different example essays, and they calibrate throughout that training to then be able to understand what a rubric like this one is looking for. The approach that we've taken is that we want our rubrics to be so objective that a student, in the very first time that they read it, understands it without having to go through a training or without having to calibrate with their teachers around what vague or somewhat accurate means or looks like. And so you're going to see some examples that are very different from this rubric as we've evolved to make sure that the communication tool in the form of a rubric is really helping our students and also ultimately our parents understand where their students are at. So I just wanted to point that out before we moved into Rubrics 2.0.
And I would say, I can't help it, but that's a best case scenario, Catherine, right? That teachers might go to a training, a 3 or 4 day training, and get calibrated around a rubric. And I would argue that even if they do that, and that rubric is littered with this subjective and vague language, the teachers might now be calibrated because they spent a lot of time talking and defining what it means to be clear. But the students still don't know what it means to be clear. And so those rubrics ultimately fail as a tool in helping students learn and grow or meet expectations. So, and as you were kind of hinting or alluding to, we've transitioned in our work to rubrics, what we like to call rubrics 2.0. Catherine coined that phrase, really creative. I'm not sure, I hadn't heard about it before, that notion, 2.0. And for us, the rubrics then, we really wanted them to be, as Catherine started to mention, transparent and explicit. And so they had distinct levels of learning, where proficient was the level that we wanted all of our students to be able to achieve if they were beneficiaries of the instruction. And that each of those levels, the proficient level and the level above and the level below, were clearly defining expectations at each of those levels, that those expectations were explicit, they were observable, and criterion referenced. And what we found is that when teachers started building these rubrics and we started doing this work to help them think about rubric writing in this way, these rubrics became really effective tools to report on what students can do, as well as a tool that students could use to help them understand what it was that they were expected to do. And I think you can go to the next slide, Jim. And so these rubrics provide our assessors, the teachers, with the exact characteristics on which they should base their judgment at each level of performance. It helps our students, provides the learners with clear information about how to be successful. Students know what it is that the teachers want them to do with these rubrics that we're going to hopefully help you learn about how to write and create. And it takes away the guesswork for the students. And it provides the students with a clear indication of how they perform. So it does both of those things. It helps them understand what's expected, and then it's a great feedback tool to help them know what it was that they did and what it is that they need to continue to work on, or how they can continue to grow or improve. And if you go to the next slide, Jim, we're going to go just a little overview of some formatting components that we also put into the rubrics, and this is the format that we've gone with, and some terms that we use. So Catherine and I might slip into these terms a little bit, so we just want to make sure everybody knows what terms we're using. When we started this work, we had our teachers identify, I think most people are familiar with the idea of power standards. So which of the content area standards they felt had the most leverage, readiness, and endurance. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they prioritized those standards and then translated those into student-friendly language, which is at the top of the rubric, which we call the essential learning. And then we had, as you can see, the 3 levels. We had mastery, proficient, and not yet proficient. And we deliberately started the formatting with the mastery, or the highest level of performance, on the left, so that a student reads that from left to right. They see the highest level of potential performance. And then the proficient level in the center is the level that we expect and want students to achieve or reach. And then the not yet proficient is the level that when they haven't yet reached the proficient. And then the supportive learnings are those discrete skills that run down that left column. And those are all the different elements or discrete skills of that overarching essential learning, standards-based essential learning. And then the supportive learning language is the language that's in each of those boxes that you see there. And that's just another term that we use. And I think I figured out the signal when Catherine has something she wants to say. So I'm going to pause and see, Catherine, you have something you want to add or clarify?
I was trying to keep it discreet, but yeah, you picked up on it. And we know you can't see the written text in this rubric. I just want to point that out. We're going to show you some examples here in a minute.
Yeah.
But I think what is important, and what we came to really enforce, I guess, was that we did want a school-wide format so that it was really accessible for our students. And so this is the format. I think that's why we wanted you all to understand this too, that this is the format that all of our rubrics in all classes look like. They're arranged with mastery on the left and not yet proficient on the right. The supportive learnings, students and teachers all are familiar with kind of this vocabulary language about what's in a rubric. And so whenever we're doing an implementation of an initiative, there's certain things that are maybe loose or tight. This is one of those things that became very tight in the sense that it helped all of our teachers to be able to then compare their rubrics with each other or access each other's rubrics. And then also, again, for students to be able, when given a rubric, they didn't have to spend time orienting to what's on the page, where's the information, what am I looking at. They could very, very quickly understand how to read a rubric in this format and this style.
And I thought you were going to say this, Catherine.
Real quickly.
Let me just finish this one thought, because Catherine started this idea around formatting on the rubric, and I forgot to mention it. And that is, and you can kind of see it. I'm so glad you recognize too, Catherine. You can't read everything here, and that's fine. But hopefully you can see that there's some bold font and some regular font. And the bold font is also a standardized component of the rubrics that we've developed or we moved towards. And that is the part in the mastery that distinguishes it from the proficient level. So on the rubrics that we have at our sites, students see the proficient level. That's, again, the level that they're shooting for. And then in the mastery in bold is the other skill that they can, that is typically an application or a synthesization of the information, a higher level skill for each of those different supportive learnings. So they do the proficient level and what's in bold, and that's how they can really clearly distinguish the next level. Sorry, Jim, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No problem. I just wanted to point out, for those of you, Catherine has been posting, if you click the little question mark at the bottom of your screen, you can see there's a Q&A, which is a little chat feature. Catherine's been posting some things for you as some reference and some questions, things to ask yourselves. You can also post questions to us. No one else will see them except for Steve, Catherine, and myself. It doesn't go to the whole group. It just comes to the three of us. So please feel free, if you have a particular question or comment you'd like to post in the Q&A, go for it. We can address that as we go along. I appreciate the format here. The standardization, especially within a school, can be very important because kids need consistency. And, we started off originally where maybe teachers didn't even know what they were assessing or why. And it was like, well, I know it when I see it. And then the rubrics brought in a level, perhaps with some calibration, with teachers being able to say, now I know what I'm looking for, but it didn't include the students or the parents in it. And until students and parents can read those rubrics just as easily and be able to know before they do the assignment what success looks like, that's the real power. And I also know you have some thoughts about mastery versus exceeds. That's always a big question in rubrics. I'm sure you'll get there in a minute. Just wanted to point out those things before we move on to the next slide.
Yeah, and we'll look at some actual examples here. We'll use that checklist here in a second as well.
And this, one of the things that we learned as we started working with our teachers on this, again, they were writing rubrics based upon the way that they had seen rubrics or interacted with rubrics before, again, often vague and subjective language. And so as we realized that we wanted to do something different with rubrics, we realized that teachers were going to need some tools and some supports to help them write rubrics that were more explicit and objective and criteria referenced. And so we developed this tool, the Rubric for Rubrics, which I am hoping that you can see because we unfortunately don't have a copy. If normally when Catherine and I are presenting, we hand out copies of this to everybody. Go ahead, Catherine. I see your signal.
I was just gonna, Jim, can you push on that plus sign? Will it make it a little bit bigger, I'm wondering, in this format? There we go.
Yeah, press it again, Jim. Let's see how big you can get it, and then we can scroll down through the document. Let's try that. How's that look on yours? Computer,
that
Catherine? I know
great.
you have
That's a little too big. Okay, there we go. Perfect.
Right, okay. So this is the Rubric for Rubrics tool that we built, and hopefully you can see this. We talked about that essential learning, that power standard, and I mentioned earlier that we asked our teachers to identify the standards that they felt had the most leverage, readiness, and endurance. And so we defined those terms for them. So endurance is, of course, transcending a single unit of study. Leverage is something that would apply to more than one content area, and readiness, preparing students for the next level of learning. So we asked them to go through their standards, identify which standards they felt met these criteria. And we tried to model the proficient and the mastery level, that the mastery would be all 3 versus 2, which is not our best rubric technique. We'll acknowledge, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but this is a document we developed early on in the process. And what we found is our teachers were really competitive. They wanted to find standards that met all 3 of those criteria. And then we wanted them to make sure that they were writing the essential learning in student-friendly language. So often those standards are written in language that itself can be confusing, I think, to educators. If you sat down with a group of teachers and you asked them to look at any single standard together, they might all have different interpretations or different understandings of that standard. So part of the work was sitting down with PLCs and having them process through and convert or translate that standards-based language into really student-friendly, student-accessible language, so that students and parents could understand what it was the students were learning or doing on the rubric. And then the supportive learning language, we talked about making sure the supportive learning language covered each of the discrete skills that make up the essential learning. That's the supported learning alignment, excuse me. And so that was really about breaking down that overarching standard into, well, what are those discrete skills, or what are those pieces that a student needs to be able to do? How can we chunk that in a way that we can then support students in developing those individual skills, or those separate skills that are part of that standard? And then if you scroll through that page just a little bit, Jim, so we can see the supportive learning language. And the supportive learning language, similarly, we wanted that language to be explicit and define what a student needs to do or know, and make sure that that language is objective, so that it wasn't open to interpretation. Make sure that that supportive learning language is student-friendly, like the essential learning. And our goal was that a student or a parent wouldn't need additional clarification. So that was the mastery level here, is that a student and a parent can understand how to grade the assignment based solely on the language in the rubric. And then we really wanted to move teachers away from using percentages, and we'll talk about that as a way to distinguish between the proficiency levels. You can see that in the mastery column. And then the communication piece was really critical. And this was really more about the culture that we were trying to establish with our teachers as they developed these rubrics, to make sure that they were using them consistently in all the classrooms. And so reviewing the rubrics with the students prior to the beginning of an assignment, making sure the rubric was available to students and they knew where and how to find them, as long as they were working on that assignment. And some of these things we've resolved with the software that we've developed that makes these assignment rubrics available to students online. They can access them anywhere, anytime. And then that component of having students self-assess their work using the rubric prior to turning in the assignment was sort of the mastery component of what we were looking for teachers to do as far as their interaction or using of those rubrics or working with those rubrics with their kids. And then seeing no sign from Catherine that she has anything to add here, I'm going to ask you, Jim, to move to the next slide. And then we'll talk about the rubric do's and don'ts, another tool that we developed.
Yeah, do you want me to take over on
And
this
I'll move through this one a little bit. Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yep. You want to do
Yeah.
that? You can go from here. Yeah.
Yeah, this was just a resource that we developed after seeing a lot of examples. We won't go into all the details here, but it definitely helped us start to give teachers, especially if they had a draft rubric, we built some skills around this. We really wanted them to move away from language like best effort or turns in high quality, but instead give kids actual things that they can look for. So that example of having a beginning, middle, and end labeled and a description of the actions really helps a student understand what high quality can look like. The next one down is the percentages. And so we really ask teachers to think outside of a percentage-based criterion reference. So instead, again, being specific, what did they want the students to actually do with the piece of literature or the piece of reading? You can scoot down, Jim, a little bit. We're happy to share these resources too. These are things that sometimes people follow up with us and want copies of. We're happy to share these. Again, using frequencies that are sort of nebulous when we say sometimes or often or mostly, those are things that have different meanings to different people. Even different teachers sometimes think, well, mostly might be 9 times out of 10, or another teacher might say mostly is, more than half of the time. So we tried to really help our teachers not use language like that, instead be specific, things that could be actually measured or things that were concrete. And then also, as it says, we didn't want to necessarily assess students on things that, do they understand it or not? Instead, we wanted them to actually show us, can they do those things? And then also in the not yet proficient, we really wanted to give examples. So in that example, right, the do, if you're going to say be respectful, what does that look like? In parentheses, it actually has some examples there of what respectful looks like, or not respectful, some examples there of what it might look like to be not respectful, because we wanted students to be able to actually picture themselves in doing these things. So we're ready for the next one, and we're going to actually look at some rubrics here in a minute. This is another checklist that we found ourselves using. It kind of helped us run rubrics through a kind of a quality assurance system. And we would have teachers look at each other's rubrics sometimes and be able to, think about these different criteria. So again, a resource that we're happy to share when it comes to thinking about are rubrics objective or subjective? And then you can scroll down, Jim. And thinking about these examples or non-examples, again, in the not yet proficient versus the proficient versus the mastery. Are you actually giving them something that illustrates what it is you're looking for? And then again, moving away from percentages. So this handout is something that was kind of just another piece that we added as we were starting to edit and improve draft rubrics. Okay. And the next one here, so this one you can make it a little smaller. Thanks, Jim, for being the navigator. So these questions have been added to the question and answer thread. You're going to use them as we're looking at a couple of rubrics here in a minute. But we really liked our teachers to ask themselves these questions when they felt like a rubric was finished. Always going back to, is the language objective or subjective? And what does objective mean versus what does subjective mean? Is it written in student-friendly language that the student can access easily? And right off the bat, the first time they look at the rubric, are they able to really understand what's written on the rubric? And then that question, could a parent even grade the assignment based solely on the language, or another perhaps education assistant or instructional assistant? Does the rubric give them enough information that they know what the teacher is looking for and what the student should be doing? And then also those pieces around formatting that Steve pointed out, that we'll look at and compare and contrast here on these next two example rubrics. And then mastery, we talked a little bit about, but that our mastery column, we've decided that mastery, or whether you're calling it exceeds, that higher level column, should really be distinguished by an additional skill or a different piece of knowledge that's being applied, and that we want our students to be going kind of above and beyond. And it's not just necessarily doing something more or doing the same thing better. So you'll see some examples of that here in just a minute. So this is a rubric that's actually a non-example. So this is one that was more of similar to what we got turned in by teachers in the beginning of the process. And so we want you to kind of look at this for a minute and notice, you'll see some things that are maybe not very subjective, that are not examples of our added mastery skill. Usually when we do this activity, I'm sorry, that are not objective. You'll see some examples that are not objective, they are subjective. You'll also see some examples that don't fit those checklists that we were just looking at. Normally when we do this activity, we hand out both the two copies of the rubric so people can look at them side by side. But in this format, we just wanted you to get a sense of this was kind of what we might see generally. And so when you think to yourself using those questions in the Q&A, is it objective or subjective? Could a parent grade it? Does mastery provide us with an additional application of knowledge or skill? And then scrolling down, Jim, the last two, supportive learning after connections, there's some good examples here. And oftentimes our participants in workshops, when they're looking at these two rubrics next to each other, they point out that visualize, right, in proficient, that middle column, draw an artistic picture that represents a strong understanding of the story. Artistic is something that's fairly subjective. And then when our mastery criteria becomes draw an extremely artistic picture that represents an exceptionally strong understanding of the story, that doesn't necessarily give our students a good understanding of what is artistic, what is extremely artistic, what is exceptionally strong. It's just, in some ways, it's just saying, do something better and hope that you kind of hit that mark. And so for our students, and especially we work with middle school students quite a bit, we certainly know even high school and certainly elementary school kids might have really different interpretations of what extremely artistic is. Also on this rubric, for example, figurative language, you see in the proficient, find a strong example of figurative language versus mastery, find several strong examples. So very subjective. What is several? Do you want them to do 2 or 3, or are you looking for 10 strong examples? So that would be something that students might interpret in many different ways. So we'll move on to our next one that gives us more an example of what we are looking for. Again, this checklist is the questions that we'll be assessing it against. And then we'll move to the rubric itself. So this is the same exact rubric. It has the same essential learning across the top: read, understand, and interact with literature. That's from a 6th grade cluster of standards that our teachers identified. And then they broke that down into these supportive learnings: vocabulary, questions, connections, and down below the figurative language and the visualize. But now you'll see some differences in a rubric like this. So this is a rubric 2.0. The vocabulary, ask about and look up definitions when words are unknown, is giving the student a really clear, concrete task as to what they should do when they have a word that they don't know. Then in mastery, you see that there's an added component in bold and italicized, using the vocabulary in another context. So that might look, the teacher might give an assignment to write some sentences using the vocabulary words, and that's one way that they could get to that mastery level. Also questions, on the other example was more vague. In Proficient, it said, ask questions about, when questions come up, whereas this one really specifically asks our students to ask who, what, where, and when questions about the characters, setting, and plot. And then in Mastery, it gives them an additional, more challenging, deeper level of knowledge of asking why and how questions to investigate cause and effect, predictions, and reasoning. And so again, Bloom's taxonomy helps us think about those things that are going to be deeper thinking skills that we want our students to be doing. Then as it moves down, you can see that the figurative language again is more specific. It introduces our students to those vocabulary words of figurative language with metaphors and similes, and that we want them to explain what it means. And then also in Mastery, we then invite our students to make a prediction or draw a conclusion about the story, theme, or characters based on the understanding of the figurative language. And again, you notice that Proficient language is repeated in the Mastery up above, and then the Mastery additional skill is always listed below. And this is what I was saying earlier, when we get to perhaps 4 or 5 levels on a rubric, sometimes it can be hard to then add a specific skill in each of those columns. And so that's where our work around this really moved us. We wanted to be super clear. We wanted to be super objective. We wanted students to be able to use this as both a checklist and a self-assessment tool. And so we stayed within these 3 columns so that we could always make sure that we were distinguishing between Proficient and Mastery with an added skill. And then below in Visualize, instead of an artistic picture, we're just asking students to create some sort of visual representation, a picture image of the sensory language from the story. And again, helping them think about what sensory language is, what it looks like, sounds, smells, tastes, or feels like, is helping them think about what they're going to be looking for when they're reading the story. And then an added Mastery skill of creating a picture image of the figurative language. So these are, hopefully that kind of gives you contrast with that first rubric that was much more subjective, might have been harder for someone else to grade, certainly wasn't as accessible to a student. And this one is kind of the style that we've been trying to move towards.
And Catherine, one of the interesting things that occurred to me as you were talking about, some schools, it always strikes me when they want 5 levels of proficiency, it feels like all they want is A, B, C, D, F under another form. But the real answer, the real interesting thing is that if you're a teacher or anyone, you're trying to make a rubric with even 4 different levels, and you are really having trouble distinguishing between, say, almost proficient and proficient, or almost mastery. Well, what does that say? What that really says is you really don't have the tools to make that precise a distinction. And sometimes we fool ourselves as teachers when a student gets an 87.3% average, and we think, wow, that's very precise. Look at how. And of course, there's no way we know within a 1/10 of a percentage point of the student's performance. And that's what strikes me. If you can't really distinguish the language between 2 proficiency levels, then you should ask yourself, well, how could I distinguish it? Even under a traditional system, there's really no great way to distinguish that.
No, I think that's a great point, Jeff. I think, and then often, right, our students pick up on the feeling that, our teacher in that case, right, a teacher might kind of hem and haw back and forth, like, well, is it somewhat clear or mostly clear? And they give them a score based on that, but the student themselves might almost feel a sense of injustice in some ways, feeling like, well, how did I end up with this score versus this score? And the teacher may or may not be able to explain very clearly why it fell into one category or the other. Okay.
And I just want to add to that. The other thing with those 5 levels is that what are you trying to do with that many levels, right? What's your goal? Is your goal to make sure that kids are learning a specific skill or are able to demonstrate some specific content knowledge or something that they've learned? Or is your goal to sort of separate them into as many different categories as you can? And I think that's what the traditional letter grades do. And that's why we often fall into that pattern on rubrics. We think, well, we really need to sort and filter these kids into they're proficient or they're almost proficient or they're not there or they're a little bit better or they're a lot better, rather than really just saying, here are the things we want our kids to learn. This is what it looks like when our students demonstrate those skills or knowledge to us, and let's work to get everybody to that level. And so for us, that was the conversation that we really had here, is what is our goal? What's our purpose? And our purpose was to get all of our students to proficient. So we didn't want to spend a lot of time saying you're almost there. We wanted to say you're there or you're not there. And here are the things that you can do in the proficient column. And here are the things that you haven't yet showed us that you can do in the not yet proficient column. And then the students could then move forward from the with the things that they didn't yet demonstrate and work to demonstrate those things, or work to learn those things and show us that they learned those things so that they could become proficient. And then of course the column above, the mastery or the exceeds, and whatever people want to call that, is the piece for those kind of going back to those to 4 questions, or what are you going to do when a student already knows something or they've already learned it? And it provides that additional challenge opportunity for kids that are seeking something more challenging or more rigorous from your class.
We promised a short webinar. We've gone to about 36 minutes at this point. We have so much that we can say about this work because we've spent a lot of time on it. But I do want to say, I think in closing, I'm not sure if we have another slide or two, but what was very powerful is when our teachers, started in the beginning, we had to prompt them to come at the end of the year with some updates to their rubrics, or we might say, hey, is there anything now that you've used this rubric for a year that you want to update or change? And oftentimes with the prompt, they might bring us some updates, some edits. But in I think kind of the end of our second and very much into our third year, teachers were actually volunteering. Hey, I want to update my rubric. I realize it's not as clear as it could be. If I make this change, it'll be even easier for students to understand what I'm looking for. And they started really coming forward with those edits in the spring, because they wanted their rubrics to be as clear and explicit as possible. And so we knew that the work had really caught on at that point. These are some pictures of our students using rubrics in the classroom. And this one helps you understand how, for example, teachers can hand out the rubric at the beginning of a unit or a lesson or an assignment. They can use that as an instructional tool as they're working through the different pieces that they're expecting of the students. And then in this case, the students were asked to self-assess before turning the assignment in at the end of the unit. And in yellow, the student highlighted where they believed that they were within each piece of the rubric. Then the teacher used that rubric that had the yellow highlighting and added their orange highlighting to be able to give the student feedback. And again, this is a really powerful tool when we calibrate our students and teachers, where a student might think that they're doing something, but they aren't actually there yet, or they aren't yet doing that. And the teacher can correct them with feedback, just like a coaching model, and help them understand, well, you're doing this and this and this, but you're not yet doing this. And then we found that the students actually then feel more empowered to try again and want to succeed the next time around, because they're given really clear information about what they need to do to be successful.
And I just want to add one thing before we wrap up. What we've shown you are these essential learning standards-based rubrics, which are kind of the heart and soul of the work that we have done on our sites. And the question that sometimes comes up, well, are you assessing the students all the time on all of those discrete skills from an essential learning rubric? And the answer to that question is no. What's great about these, the way we've developed these rubrics and the tools that we've developed through Smart Ed Systems, is an ability to take those essential learning rubrics that are those standards-based rubrics and then break them down very quickly into assignment rubrics, where you can pull just maybe 1 or 2 discrete skills from a rubric or from multiple rubrics and assemble them together into an assignment rubric that can be used in the classroom for any assignment that a teacher does. And one of the biggest and most significant transformations I think that we've seen with this work is that the overwhelming majority, I like to say all, but Catherine corrects me that, all means every single one, and it's not true that it's every single one, so that is true. But the overwhelming majority of the assignments given at Ashland Middle School now, for example, are standards-based assignments. It's very rare that a teacher would give an assignment that is not linked to one of those discrete supportive learnings from their essential learning rubric, or often maybe 2 or 3. You can see on the example on this picture, there's a half sheet, and that's an example of an assignment that has 2 discrete supportive learnings, and they may be from as an example, from 2 different rubrics. And similarly, the one on the left could be similar. Each of those essential learnings could be from maybe 3 different rubrics. So teachers can pull together those discrete skills and create a very customized assignment rubric that's linked to their standards-based essential learning rubrics, which is really revolutionary. And if anybody's interested in seeing that software or how to do that, we can certainly show you that at another time if you want to reach out to any one of us. And we are happy to walk you through and show you how easy it is to create an assignment rubric based upon a standards-based rubric.
And Steve, one of the great things that you didn't touch on, you kind of buried the lead in that after several years of using these rubrics that teachers, your PLCs created, you've seen a very, very high correlation between the scores students receive on these rubrics and the scores that they get on the Smarter Balance test that students take every year. And although I'm not in love with standardized testing in general, the Smarter Balance is something that a lot of us just have to live with. And it's some of what you're judged by, like it or not. But for me, it really speaks to how well crafted the rubrics are, and the fact that you can look, the teachers could look in late April, right? Even early April, look at the scores students have and know with pretty high confidence if that student is going to pass the Smarter Balanced or not. And in addition, because of the scores broken down by standards, know where do I reteach? Where do I get the best bang for my buck to reteach particular kids to get them over the hump? I mean, you actually have a formula based on your rubrics of how many proficient scores and mastery scores a student needs, so that you know with over 90% confidence that they will pass the Smarter Balance, which is pretty great. We found that the correlation between the scores and the Smarter Balance scores are right up there with the SAT, what the SAT advertises as their correlation. So it's pretty solid, and I think it speaks to how well crafted your rubrics are at Ashland Middle School.
That's very true. Thanks, Jim, for mentioning that. Yep.
You're too modest to say it yourself. Well, I appreciate keeping this short. I know everyone here is either at lunch or are ready to go about their day, but thank you all for coming. Again, if you do have any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out. There are plenty of ways on our website that you can reach out to Steve or Catherine or myself. You can email us, you can visit the website. We're happy to talk more about it. We are passionate about making all learning for kids transparent and explicit and accessible to every single student and parent. That's what it's all about. And so thank you for coming today. We appreciate it. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody.